Okay, so I mean, I feel like this was a great example of walking through a core member where, you know, how are you making sure that in the preparing yourself phase, you've thought through what are the specific changes that I'm defining for these students and this core member, and like, what does that mean it has to change in my own practice, and then let me get really clear about the actions that I'll be taking to make these changes happen. And as we've talked through how you're going to monitor progress, it sounds to me that you have a plan for how you also want to invest her by using her vision. You and I now sort of taking this one layer up. You know, each week from here on out, like as we touch base about what's going on with your movers, I'm also going to be asking you to what degree are we starting to see the student change happen. And I'm probably going to ask you for pieces of evidence. So like, you know, tell me about either the conversation that you had with Mary that suggested that the students are starting to build these cultural, you know, they're starting to build these traits and mindsets or whatever. Or, you know, show me an assessment where her students are now making higher scores on the word part of things than they were beforehand. Just so that you and I are making sure we're holding ourselves accountable to the changes that we say needs to be happening. And then in terms of just sort of monitoring to make sure that the actions are being taken place, like, I'm not necessarily gonna like ask you like, did you send that email to Mary? Did you blow, you know, that kind of deal. But I'm definitely, as I ask you about did the changes themselves happen, I'm gonna assume that you've done the specific actions necessary to make those changes happen, right? Like you set up the meetings with her, or you've, you know, done the skill building with her or whatever. And like, if you get to a point where you're like, actually, I don't know how to help Mary think through, you know, building these traits and mindsets with her kids, then you pull me in and let's talk about how do we figure that out together. Does that make sense?
Yes, and that's where I think I would like a bulk of our again to be spent. It's like thinking through those when I'm stumped, really, kind of thing. Because she has the same situation, and Josh. Like Josh has 45 students, and 10 of them we identified as a subset, and it's been the same 10 all year. And I'm like, okay, why is it the same 10 all year? What's not happening? T, the same thing. There's 4 students, same level all year. I'm like, okay, it's March. Why are they the same for the whole year? So that's where I want to grow in my skill. It's like if core members who show me their data and they have this subset of students who have remained in this subset of being the lowest in achievement for the entire year, and we're in March, like, what do you do with that? Like, how do you start with that if this teacher hasn't been able to achieve any significant type of change to move any of those students out of that bucket? So, but that's just for another conversation.
I mean, I think that's for every subsequent conversation.
Right.
I feel like a lot of times that comes down to one of two things, right? Either we didn't define the right change, right? Like whatever we said we needed to focus on and work on, and like we didn't prioritize the right gap and we didn't come up with the right change, so we've been doing stuff that wasn't going to make the difference anyways. Or, you know, we haven't been doing it long enough or hard enough or enough of it. Maybe we defined the right change, but we're not implementing it as best we could, and so we're not seeing the real traction. So I think as we get more and more in the process of like defining the change and then monitoring the change, you and I will be able to step back each week and say, all right, we haven't seen any traction here, or we have, why or why not? And then we can dig into that question of, man, these students are still low, or man, these students aren't low anymore because the things we've been doing aren't the right things, whatever. But I think those are questions that we're going to be asking in subsequent check-ins from now on. Okay, so let's talk about action plan. But was this helpful, like thinking through Mary and thinking about what what you would do to define change for her and like monitor? Can you do me a favor for her? So like I really do think this was helpful when I sat in on Lauren Lamont's check-in last week, and I saw her like how she worked through this sort of like defining the change and then the timeline for the change process with one of her core members. I don't know I don't want to like tie you to templates or anything like that, but if you want to use something that's similar to her process, I would encourage you to do so in the conversation so that you and Mary both are very clear on, here's what's going to be happening, here's why, here's the timeline for our work together, here's what we should be expecting of each other, that kind of deal.
So she created that in the moment with the core member, or that's something she brought to the table?
She did a lot of the thinking beforehand, but in the moment, she shared this with the core member, and they walked through it together. And so it was like a dual core member and the PD sort
So
of
like in the
created
moment,
it.
she was typing and adding things to it, like,
Depending on what happened in the conversation, yeah.
okay,
But she had initial thoughts beforehand,
okay,
based on like, her looking at his data and her being in his classroom, that kind of deal.
okay.
Yeah, and you should probably talk to her a little bit more just about how she fully prepared for the conversation, because this was a big part of it, but I'm sure she did other things, similar to what we were just doing right now. I don't think so. But I think this is like going back to what we talked about on Friday of like making sure that your skill is built to really manage the whole process and organize like your thoughts around, here's how I'm gonna engage with a whole group of core members. This could really help with that planning part of things.
So she did, that document was for her movers for the week. That was for
Yeah,
her.
these are, so like the one I sent
She had
you
three
was three
folks.
folks, and they actually had a joint conversation because they teach the same content, subject, and all that good stuff. But like, the one I was talking about was the one with their core members, Gerard, I never know how to pronounce the dude's name. But she had a separate plan for him. So like, but these are movers, yeah. And so she didn't have that level of detail for everybody, just like her key folks for each week. Okay, so let's look at your action plan.
So, I think I need to change the bottom of that because that's kind of, well, maybe no,
When you say the bottom, you mean the shape part?
yeah.
I mean, this is where I think, like, I think this is helpful, because this is actually where I think now, so for example, you have like the visits with co-investigations with Mary, Nikki, and Emily and all that stuff, like, and up top you have sort of some context for why they're movers for which category. I think it's helpful though for you to get really concrete about the actions that you're taking, like Monday, Tuesday, the days leading up to the conversation. So like, I'm observing them for what? What are you looking for when you observe them?
I'm doing student interviews to get context on like student investment. And
For every person or like for individuals? Like that's the thing.
well, I want to get that context for everyone because I want to start thinking more holistically about TAL teaching.
Gotcha.
Holistically. So
Okay.
that's
So-
just one piece though. That's just one part of the observation.
But I would imagine different teachers, when you're going in, you're looking for different things, right? Depending on where their data is, depending on what they need as a teacher. And so I would be making a note of that. Maybe you're capturing this in your head somewhere, but I actually would be preparing this perhaps in my action plan the week of, or the day of that I'm going to observe. So if I know, for example, that I'm gonna go see Mary now, like actually, where would we spend most of our time in Mary's classroom? We would probably spend most of our time with these 4 cats, right? And like, we would probably, I wanna get a gauge on like what's going on with the rest of the class, but I specifically wanna spend more of my time with these 4 cats, spending my time like talking to them, asking them questions, looking at maybe some of their student work if possible. Like, I think you having done this process before you go in to see Mary and then talk to Mary, I don't know if you're seeing Mary, you might not even need to see her classroom, but if you are, like, this is gonna guide where you spend your time.
Right.
And so that should be reflected in your, sort of like the actions that you're taking for each of the days. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just need, these categories don't make sense. I just need to change.
Yeah, change the categories. Maybe you change them to like, what am I looking for in an observation for that person? Or like, I don't know, or maybe you change it to the names. And maybe then like for each of the buckets of names, you're just writing out specific actions that you're taking for that person for that
That
day.
makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
'Cause
Yeah.
I don't need-
Yeah, and remember this was mine, so this, you're gonna have to here. But other than that, like I think it was helpful that you at least start the process off by getting clear about who are your priorities
I like this a lot.
and why they're priorities. Now it's let's take that to the next level and talk about what that means I need to do for them. And let's be clear for each of these people, like what is the specific change by the end of the week for them?